Well, good morning, and thank you very much. A very special thank you, because I think Davos is probably the only place on earth where you can, with a straight face, look at someone and invite them for breakfast at 7 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday, and they won't laugh at you. We still laughed. It's a sort of, I think there's a human rights issue in there somewhere for what time breakfast should start or not at Davos. But welcome and thank you for making it. I think we're in for a rich discussion today. You have on your tables the new report, Seeking New Leadership, which is going to be the backbone of the discussion. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But let me begin just personally by setting some of the context. I was absolutely privileged, incredibly, 10 years ago now. Is it 10 years? John will tell me, maybe 11 years ago, to be voted one of the World Economic Forum's young global leaders. I have to say, before that, I looked young and sprightly, and it turns out that decade has not treated me as well as it might have done. But on a serious note, that decade really did treat me unbelievably well, and in no small part due to the extraordinary opportunities that group presents, whether or not it's learning modules at places like Harvard, whether or not it's simply the connections with extraordinary people doing extraordinary things from lots of diverse sectors. And with that context, and I think he's not in the room, so sort of it's not toadying, but I think also kudos to Klaus Schwab, who has always been unbelievably passionate about that group and also about the Shapers group, the global Shapers community, and the fact that those Shapers community, woohoo! Well, I was going to introduce them later, but seeing as we've introduced them already, let's have beaming in live from Beijing and Prague. Can we have our Shapers communities, please? Very good. So, can we put the mics on? Would you like to say hello? Beijing?
Hello from Beijing.
Excellent.
Hello. Hi.
Good stuff. And then Prague?
Hello there.
Hi.
Very good. Very good to have you with us, and we'll come back to you later and make this an interactive session. So they will hang in the background. You can rest assured everyone can see you. Look, and the Global Shaper community, I think exactly the same. There are phenomenal opportunities that are presented. And I think it's within that vein that Ellen and I, with Julie, our CEO's support, we're really, really proud to step up and be able to support the community over the next few years, both in investing obviously the money that's required to keep these kinds of things moving forward, but also what we wanted to do was to work with the community, work with the YGLs, work with the Shapers, to drive the Shaper and YGL community forward. And I think the thing that we have focused on is this topic of responsible leadership. And I think what we hope is that this framework that we'll talk about in a second is a way of anchoring the YGL and Shaper journey in a thoughtful and conscious approach to developing responsible leadership. So that over the course of the 5-6 years, Shapers are 5 years still, or 6 years? 10 years, wow, okay. 10 years, okay, very good. Well, so as over the course of your individual journey through the YGL and Shaper community, there's a conscious focus of the modules, of the activities, of the experiences that help both the individual to think about what kind of capabilities they should be developing as leaders, to be able to manage successfully, maybe the traditional metrics of success, but also, very importantly, given the week we have here, in a way that includes stakeholders, in a way that takes note of and incorporates managing for the Sustainable Development Goals and make sure that we actually do well by doing good at the same time. So that's the purpose of that. Now, we are offering the framework up not as a, right, well, look, we all went into a dark room and we sort of came up with a nice sort of set of 5 elements. It really is intended to be a stake in the ground for you to react to say, what resonates? And I'm going to talk to some of the panelists about what resonates, what's missing, how could we nuance things to make sure that we really do develop leaders in the future through these communities that are capable in the ways that we want them to be able to be, of managing for purpose, managing with impact. So on your, where's my copy gone? I think my copy was supposed to be.
It's on the sofa there.
Is that my copy? Thank you very much. So, I think you've got the short version, but if you have a look here, you will see the absolute core of the framework. And it was a phenomenal process and privilege. over the course of the last 6 months, we've worked with 2,000 shapers and YGLs to get their inputs on these topics. I will say the shapers were more responsive than the YGLs, which I think is generally true. But we had a real...
about that at our Shaper board meeting.
Oh, it's competitive now, is it, Ellen? So it's you versus me, Shaper board versus YGL board. Okay. Right, YGLs. Get your act together. No, look, on a serious note, we've received some fantastic insights. We did one-to-one interviews, we also did some online surveys, and we put real economics behind some of this as well. So we tried not to leave it just qualitative, but also to look at whether or not leaders that are employing some of these characteristics, as best as we can determine, are they actually becoming more successful leaders as well? And so I'll just introduce you very, very briefly to a few elements of the framework and a few interesting findings to tee us up. The first, to that point about success, is that when we looked at leaders that display these kinds of characteristics, stakeholder inclusion, emotion and intuition, mission and purpose, technology and innovation, and intellect and insight, we found that there's a real business premium. So we looked at companies right across industries, right across geographies, and we looked at them over reasonable time horizons, and we could see that there was a 3.9%, let's be careful not to round it to decimal points, let's say a reasonable uplift in terms of premium, in terms of their EBITDA, in terms, and this is in the corporate sector. We've only so far able to look at the corporate sector. We think actually if you look at responsible leadership, we need to look across more sectors so we understand what success and impact looks like. But even in the corporate sector, that kind of uplift, that is hard work, knowing as a strategy consultant, knowing how hard it is to get a 4% uplift. I mean, if you just took it on its own terms of financial returns and success, it's a pretty impressive premium, forgetting the fact that this is actually also about creating broader impact in the world. I've introduced those 5 key elements. We actually, even in the course of preparing for the panel, Alison, you said, well, where's curiosity? Where are some other themes? And I think that's exactly what is intended, to tease out, whether these are the right elements, but also are there other knowledge sets, skill sets, mindsets, attitudes that need to be incorporated in the way that we frame responsible leadership. I'll finish with 2 other things that I think were very interesting, which is that it shows that, first of all, the corporate issue and then an intergenerational leadership issue. The first is that it shows that the group that we studied, the YGLs and Shaper group, place far more emphasis on mission and purpose and emotion and intuition than existing companies and existing leaders. If you look at the way they weight the importance of the different quotients, I think that's probably intuitive for a lot of us, but I think also a number of us have discussed that may not be the way that we grew up. In the classic business schools and the sort of the classic frameworks that we've been taught in business, that may not be the way that we were developed. So it is a conscious process to think about how we refresh and address some of those things. And then the final one also is interesting, is that 61%, to speak to the theme of this week, 61% of the 2,000 leaders we surveyed within the 2 communities said that business models should only be pursued if they generate improved societal outcomes and profitable growth in tandem, and were far more focused on stakeholder inclusion in that process of value creation as well. So I think there's an interesting piece going on there between the corporate world and the next generation of broader leaders coming through, and also between different generations of leaders. So I'm going to kick off just with a few remarks from our panel to start with, just to set the tone. You've all read the report. You've written the report with me. You've read the report. So let me start off. So Ellen, why this research and collaboration? Why now? And what do you think the responsible leadership definition and importance really is?
Well, I think why now is clear, right? The definition of capitalism as we know it today is no longer working. In fact, if anyone picked up the Edelman Trust Barometer on Monday morning, there was a lot of fascinating information, but the thing that stuck out for me was that 56% of the people who were surveyed for the Trust Barometer said capitalism as we know it today is doing more harm than good. And that lays a very strong foundation for a change. And I think, there's been a lot of discussions this week around, well, what does that really mean? And I think what's really fascinating is that when you tap into next generation leaders who are leading on the ground today in the communities that they live and work, and the YGLs leading on the global stage in a very significant way. And the stat Peter talked about, 61% of the group think that they need to, businesses should only exist if they can achieve both. I mean, that's just laying the framework for what the world expects and what the world needs. And, you know, from our perspective, we've been a little bit of a sandbox, actually, because, you know, we're a young public company. And since we've gone public, we've performed about in the upper quartile of our peer group in total return to shareholders. So we have ticked the box on financial performance. So Milton Friedman would be proud. But at the same time, when you look at the context in which we did it, we created 250,000 jobs in the last 5 years for Accenture people. We've spent $5 billion on training and developing our own people and helped over 1 million people get skills to either get a job or start a business. And when you look at the collection of those things all together, the proof is there that you can create value while honoring values. And I think the time is now to really shift to that as a society.
There you go. Applause. Very good. Thank you, Ellen. Alison, in our conversation when we were briefing for this, I think we got quite quickly to the conclusion that leadership in good times is not as difficult as leadership in adversity. I mean, it's obvious by definition at a certain level, but you know, they say the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fires, right? And I think what I would be interested from your perspective is your own personal experience of that, but also how do you prepare leaders in your organisation or in organisations for that? How do you make sure they have those experiences?
Yeah, I think the word I talked about was resilience. Certainly when I went through the report, one of the you mentioned curiosity, which I thought might have been missing, but I definitely think resilience is missing. And the reality is, if you think of whether it's you think at a macro level or a very micro level, at the macro level, the world needs resilience because unfortunately, a lot of the issues that we see facing the planet, whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about cyber risk, we have to build resilience in order to actually deal with the consequences of them. It's exactly the same is true for leadership. If we don't build resilience in our leaders, then their ability to deal with these kinds of challenges doesn't exist. And if I certainly talking to my colleagues and my peers, there is a very common trait. We have all been through adversity, whether that's personal adversity on situations that you've dealt with, which have absolutely nothing to do with work, or in the work environment where things have utterly not gone to plan and you've made very big mistakes.
Could you give us an example?
I've made
Sorry to
plenty.
put you on the spot.
No, I've made plenty. I did tell you that, yes. I'm very happy. I think it is about learning from mistakes. Probably one which was a little earlier in my career, but I still managed to get promoted to a management board afterwards, so obviously it didn't matter. Obviously, I learnt from it. I was looking after a transaction team we made an epic mistake in a spreadsheet. Spreadsheets are the devil. Can I just say that? Absolutely the devil.
That's a good quote.
It's a little concerning.
But we did make a multi-million-dollar error. It was a very, very big error, and not in the right way. Right. And so it's fair to say it didn't go particularly well, having made such a catastrophic loss.
I've never made an Excel spreadsheet.
But what do you do with it? Well, you can either kind of put your head in the sand and go, oh my God, what happens now? Or you can say, okay, as quickly as possible, fess up, explain what went wrong, and more importantly, what have you learned? What's going to be different? So we created something called the golden rules of spreadsheet usage, which I then abided by every time after that, because there's no way I was going to do that again.
Those, yeah.
But I mean, that's a very micro example, but I think what is really important is to be super happy to say, I've made a mistake as quickly as you possibly can, and here's what I've learned, and let's make sure nobody else makes the same mistake that I did, so that you can share that learning. And I think if we think of some of the challenges that we face as a society, we do actually need to keep sharing the learnings of the things that are working and the things that aren't working.
And I think one of the things about that is once you have failed and been forgiven, I think it also encourages you to do that with your leaders and to pay that on, I think, as well.
Yes.
Antonio, one of the things we talked about is that, this is a framework of, that helps us to think about leadership, but you can't divorce leadership and the capabilities you need to build from the organizational context, from the external context around you. And so in your view and your experience, how have you managed to navigate that maze?
Yeah, not particularly well. No. Good morning.
Pretty well.
Yes, it's great to be here, and it is the power of the YGL community that I'm here at the 7 a.m. on a Thursday towards the end of Davos. So only good friendship could,
I promise you a good bottle
get
of
me
wine.
here. So I think if we step back, for me, and we've been talking about this week, the world has fundamentally changed, and I don't think we need to spend too much time on that. But my personal view is that business leaders, myself included, and many of the people at Davos this week, have not really changed to cope with that, and they're not emotionally prepared. And what I really liked about the report is that emotional component of most business leaders, to your point, Peter, have been trained through business school,
shareholder value maximization, rational markets.
And in many ways, we're unlearning what we've learned over the last 20 to 30 years. So I think that's where we start. And for me personally, the dialogue has changed already. So I'm the CEO of private banking for HSBC. And if I look at, 2 years ago, maybe every other month, there would be a discussion around ESG and the broader impact on society, maybe with a Nordic investor typically. And last year, every single client meeting I had an ESG component to it. And not, I want to do something philanthropic on the side, but I fundamentally want to change what I'm doing. So I think that's the context.
That's the context, the broad.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And then for me, when I read the report, and I promised Peter that I wasn't going to spend the next few minutes redrafting the framework, which as an ex-consultant I would be tempted to do. I think the framework is great, and the 5 elements make a lot of sense. And if you haven't read the report yet, it's a great report. I think there were 3 that really stood out to me. I think you start with purpose, and you mentioned this coming from the Shapers and the YGLs. When I took over as CEO of the private bank, we were conscious of cameras here. We said, of course, we want our clients to do well, but I don't come to work every morning to make rich people richer. That's, by the way, if any clients are here, yes, we do want to make you richer. But there's something more fundamental to what we do, and we have 6,000 people of our 335,000 people, and we actually, and many companies have done this, but the way we expressed our own purpose in the private bank is to inspire and help, but to inspire our clients to make positive change in the world. And that's quite different from what we would have said 3, 4, 5 years ago. And that's informed by what our clients want, what our investors want, what our own people want. And we can talk a lot about the challenges that come with that, because there's quite difficult decisions that you then need to make. And we announced our energy policy 2 years ago. And at that time, we simply stopped financing coal and tar sands.
Which you got a big backlash for.
And I thought that was very obvious to do. And we got a lot of backlash that we had gone too far. This is 2 years ago. So there are real business decisions that come with that. The second element of the framework that I really like is stakeholder inclusion. And I need to give a shout out to Accenture on this. We've talked a lot about stakeholder inclusion this week. I'm very passionate about the diversity and inclusion aspect of that. The shout out to Accenture is 5 years ago exactly. I participated on a panel organized by Accenture on LGBT inclusion.
I remember that very well.
And it was the first time that actually at Davos, anybody talked about even just LGBT.
Incredibly, first time ever.
And actually that was outside the Congress Center, interestingly, and Accenture had the courage to actually do it. This year, there is actually 2 sessions in the Congress Center on LGBT inclusion. I think someone wrote on Reuters, it's the gayest Davos ever. I thought it was...
But we talked about this, it's not gay enough.
And it said, but not gay enough. And so me personally, I did that at that time. From a business perspective, though, I've been focusing much more on gender inclusion, which I know you're a big champion for Accenture. But I'm doing it because it makes sense for the business. If you think of wealth and where wealth is being created in the world, we're doing it because it's the right thing. We have a partnership with Albright. Anybody knows Albright? Basically, an association that works with women in business. It's an incredible organization. But for us, it makes good business sense. It's incredible female founders that will be commercial clients of HSBC, then are very successful and be great private banking clients. So it's taking what was an HR agenda to start with and taking that externally to our clients. So that, for me, really resonated. And then maybe the final point, which I think where report is different from most other reports I've read, is the emotion component of this. And this is the first of the five elements. And I said that leaders are not emotionally equipped to deal with the world that has changed. I think the one issue, and we've heard it throughout the week, there's an element of vulnerability that you mentioned in the report, and I learned this through my YGL journey over the last, when did I become a YGL? 11 years ago. So when I had
We're
hair,
the same vintage.
I was like, because I had hair, it was a much younger version of myself. Anyway, this week take one topic, mental health. Lots of discussions on mental health. I attended an amazing lunch yesterday, felt like last week. Yesterday over lunch, an amazing breakfast on mental health. But most leaders, particularly CEOs, talk about mental health for the others.
Yes.
They talk about, well, our people, and there's very few leaders that actually talk about that from a personal perspective.
Very few.
And that element of vulnerability, I think, is still a frontier that we haven't yet crossed, a line that we haven't crossed. And so if I use a personal example I did many mistakes, many spreadsheet mistakes, by the way, but I'll avoid those for now.
We should get the golden, get him the golden
Yes,
rules.
exactly. Can I have the rules, please? So 2 years ago, our second child, our son, was diagnosed with two very rare genetic conditions. And at that time, longer story, but I decided to take 6 months off work. Actually, I had no option. I took 6 months off work. I had a discussion and a decision on how open I wanted to be about what was happening. Yeah. Typically, when a CEO takes time off to spend with his family, it means that he's been fired. So I was quite conscious of that.
Well, very hard to come back, right? I mean, that's
exactly 5-10 years ago, you wouldn't come back from that. And it's credit to HSBC as a company rather than me as an individual that I came back 6 months later and I'm leading the private bank globally. Talking about that openly, and I came back and I'm leading what we call Nurture, which is the organization internally for working parents and carers, be it you can be caring for a child, you can be caring for a parent, and actually more than half of our employees globally fit in either of those two categories. Talking about it and actually making that part of your leadership story and actually being vulnerable about that and not being concerned, that would say, or that would mean that somehow you as a CEO are not as tough or assertive as you should be. So I think there's still a lot that we need to do in that space, and I don't see enough of that discussion.
I like that a lot. That's a vulnerability point. Juan, I mean, we talked about adversity. I mean, I have to say, you're from Venezuela. I've actually spent a long time in Venezuela a long time ago. Beautiful, amazing country, but my goodness, has it been through adversity in the last couple of decades, and unfortunately continues to go through incredible diversity. So what does responsible leadership look like for you and for some of your peers and those that you work with?
I love the report because I think from being an entrepreneur in a reality such as a Venezuelan one, you value that people are talking about this. I think our generation understands, and maybe that's why Shapers and YGLs in the surveys that you did show some difference, a generational difference. Yes. When you go down the road. It means that, when you're seeing the difficulty and the complexity of the problems that we live today around the world, you understand that you need a new type of leader in all sectors, and definitely, thank you. And definitely, what I rescue from as a main element is the purpose and the mission that you have behind. And I can give you my example. I'm a tech entrepreneur in smart cities in Venezuela. I have 72 employees there. The easiest way for me would be to leave the country and take my operation elsewhere.
Absolutely.
Because if you can imagine, if you're going to fundraise for a tech company, and your operation is in Venezuela, you can imagine what investors are saying, right? We've managed to successfully do so, but by fighting against the investors saying you need to leave. Yeah. And it's because we understand that what we are doing in that country is a beacon of hope for the rest of the people. Yeah. But at the same time is how you create value by understanding and by kind of replicating these elements across your organization. If you see, and hopefully you get the opportunity, if you see a developer in Venezuela, from my team, the guy could spend the night before coming to work without electricity, without water, and that person comes to his job and creates a platform that is used by over 15 cities in Latin America. So you see that it's not only the leaders of the organization, it's how do you take these elements to be a core principle of what you do. And once you achieve that culture in your organization, it doesn't matter the adversity or the context that you're in. I've always said that if you go to Viqua, for example, and the offices that we have there, it's like a little island in the middle of
It's a bit of a safe haven,
it's
I imagine,
a safe haven.
harbor
Exactly.
for people.
And that shows you that even in the most adverse situations, if you're able to have your mission and your purpose very clear, but I also love that you included intuition and that motion behind it, because most of it, when you're in a difficult situation in a difficult context, sorry, I'm sweating like a.
Fortunately, actually, you won't notice this from where you are, but these are very hot, actually. I think probably from a sustainability.
It's a test of resilience.
Of resiliency.
It's actually,
With a fever.
it was Alison that actually kind of.
No, thank God I don't work with spreadsheets, by the way. That's all I had to say. But definitely, I think that when you get, because you know what, I was telling the team when we spoke over the phone that me representing an emerging world perspective is important. Because I do think that we're not understanding globally the inequalities that the world is living. And we're not necessarily developing a world in which you see these individuals and the opportunities are the same. And that's where I think that...
Or the opportunity, the potential of people in those
Exactly.
situations, which is at least as good and as great.
Which is
in
amazing.
some cases greater.
And that's why I believe that having a framework like this could show, and it was a little bit to the question I asked Ellen on the lunch, is how do we change the perspective of even investors? Mm-hmm. That they don't look for stability and low risk. What if we change it and it's, let's go and look for the responsible leaders that you have across the world, even if they are in high risk environments? Because those people, I will guarantee you, will be able to change the world and reduce that inequality that we're seeing.
I think we've got some private investment money here, and we've also got some golden frameworks. I think we need a golden framework for risk investors and how we think about it. Look, that's a fantastic example.
Peter, can I just
Just
add
Maria,
one
please.
thing? Because Allison said that she had some, that resilience was important both personally and professionally. And listening to Antonio, I think as responsible leaders, we need to recognize that the personal context of an individual, of an employee, of a member of our community is as important as the professional human that comes through our doors every day. And because they're the same person.
You can't leave that behind.
And we cannot leave that behind. So if there are people, experiencing failure, experiencing adversity in the communities that they're working and living in, it is our responsibility as responsible leaders to really understand that and help lift people as human beings and not just as employees of your company.
Exactly.
And I don't know if it's the same in different countries, but in the UK at least we have we had previous generations the concepts of stiff upper lip. Yeah. You come through the corporate door, it's like, right, okay, no, I am a corporate professional and this is the box, and then I go home and I deal with it. And I think that is an intergenerational change, and I think it is part of responsible leadership that comes through in the framework and in the conversations is how do we as leaders allow people to be their whole self? It doesn't mean that we don't still expect very high results from them, it doesn't mean but we allow them to be their full selves to yourself.
And if I may quickly add, I think part of the new leadership that you see in organizations is that most of your time is spent on human interaction and on human connection with the people that are part of your work. I mean, I feel that as a CEO right now, most of my time is dedicated to talking to the individuals in the organization, knowing their problems, connecting with how can we help them help us and grow the organization. And that closeness that you have from a personal point of view changes the dynamics of how things work in a company. Yeah. And I think that's a future that we want to build, which is more human, human organizations that are very connected to their people and their stakeholders.
And what's crazy in many ways is that we're having to learn how to be human. Actually, if you think about it, we're in a world where actually we're unlearning some of the things that have happened. And I think we need a shout out to the WEF here, because I don't think actually by design, I think there was a vision for the young global leaders and then the shapers, but actually I think this sort of put us together, and I think what came out of it was something really special that had a really strong emotional component to it. And actually, this preparing yourself to be a leader in a different emotional way, actually, in my own personal journey, actually, being a young global leader actually played a big role. And it created a safe environment where actually you could be more yourself, and then progressively you took that out to the company and then to the wider world. And I think, I'm not sure if by design, but I think the YGL community evolved very much like that. And I know probably the Shapers community is even more so. I think the Shapers community even has more of that component from the Shapers I interact with.
I'm sure you noticed this, and I think that's something that's very valuable, but I think somehow we need to capture it in the responsible leadership room, because I think it's very telling, Antonio. The connections between business leaders or cross-stakeholder leaders in the YGLs, there's an authenticity to those conversations, even if they're business conversations, and there's a trust, right, that comes with that, which is very rare because of some of the more traditional ways in which we interact with each other as professionals. Right? And so that, I think, you're right, that assembly, that proximity, that sort of authenticity in the conversations plays through into a very different quality and a different kind of relationship. And it really, really does.
Absolutely.
I think we're going to, if you don't mind, we're going to run VT. I think it's as simple as that. So we've got a short video, which, Wayne, did you want to say a few words?
Yeah, well, I know that it was my responsibility. Sorry that I forgot.
No,
that was my spreadsheet.
We were getting into a good discussion.
Yeah, exactly. So I know that we're going to be sharing a video of over 700 YGLs and Shapers from the 6 continents, and I think the views that you're gonna see in this video, which is very interesting, at least for me, was that even in the different contexts, there is a commonality of leaders thinking today of the problems of tomorrow and building the organizational leadership that you need to tackle those issues or those problems that you're going to see in the future. So let's play the video.
I'll just take one moment to quickly think.
Leading when you have to make tough choices. It's easy to be a leader when times are going well and the choices are easy. But responsibility really comes up when you have to stand up for what you believe in.
Someone who can really empathize with their community.
Forward-thinking visionaries who are not looking at solving problems of today, but they're looking at solving problems of the future and keeping planet Earth healthy.
It's listening to the community, the environment, and yourself, and taking a path forward when others aren't able to act.
Someone who is not afraid to take a chance and be bold and taking sacrifices in their community.
Deeply and truly concerned about what matters to the people.
So responsible leaders continually push themselves out of their comfort zone, and they connect to the changes that are happening in the world, and they align their organizations and themselves with what those changes mean.
Someone from that community who can stand up for the rights of someone who's marginalized or may not be at the table and fight for that person to be included and have their voice heard in a really meaningful way.
That's nice. You did a different angle on that.
Thank you.
Very good. So, in reactions to that, I think we'll have a little bit more of a discussion, and then we'll go into tables where we're going to all work hard together. You know, no such thing as a free breakfast. I guess the two things are two questions. You feel free to answer either or, right? One, I think it's also very important that to not paint the picture of responsible leadership that's sort of motherhood and apple pie. Yeah. Right. We've all had to for example. We've all had to restructure organisations. We've had to restructure ours. We've, excuse me. You know, I've worked in restructuring other clients. You know, there are times when actually it's very, very difficult to live to your values, to hold yourself to the bar that you aspire to. You know, and I think given the number of changes that I think we see in the next decade ahead, which is what we're trying to prepare responsible leaders for, whether or not it's artificial intelligence changing the nature of the workforce and some jobs moving from different industries, from different roles, needing different skills, etc. There's something weird that's close to us, but it's true for all of us. Could you give personal examples of how you've had to make a tough decision where the framework issues or leadership that you've really struggled with, but you've actually, how have you reconciled that? How have you managed that? What lessons did you learn? Juan?
That's a good question. I mean, I've had quite a few, as you can imagine, based on the context. But I would say it has a lot to do with leaving in the company people that might not be going through the best time, and I know they're not providing the productivity that you would expect at a time. Obviously, when you're a startup and you're a small company, everyone counts, right? Everyone needs to chip in and help you grow the organization. But when you know that you are in such adverse situations, it's just not about letting someone go. It's about keeping them and working with them through their problems. So I would say that for me, the most, this happens to me every year. You have people that, for any given reason, are struggling. Their families are struggling, and you keep them, you work with them through the tough times, and even if in the short term it doesn't provide you with a return, to call it somehow, you see that in the long term it creates this family kind of sense in the organization that allows you to go through the tough times.
Yeah. I guess we talk about patient capital. It's almost patient leadership in certain circumstances.
Yes, definitely.
Sometimes people just need to be at a different pace, or they need to have a different supporting mechanism.
Which, when you're young, it's very difficult, by the way, to be patient. That's not something that they teach you.
It's not just a young thing.
Yeah, exactly.
You didn't see patience anywhere in the YGL framework.
There is actually, I think this short-term versus long-term tension is absolutely there. I completely agree with Juan. So my personal experience, I mentioned this point around purpose earlier, and it's interesting that we actually created, the vision and the purpose and the words around it with all of our employees within the bank. And when we actually launched it, there was a huge pushback saying, well, and it's in the public domain. We've reduced costs. We've had restructurings, etc. People saying, why now? So why are we talking about purpose when we are making people redundant, when we're reducing costs? And it was quite a big tension. And speaks to your point, Peter. I felt.
I was going to say, did you feel the tension?
So, and we had a discussion as a leadership team saying, is this now the right moment to do this? And the way I addressed it was by being very upfront about it, that we as a team discussed it, and we felt strongly that it was the right moment to talk about it. Because for two reasons. One, there's never a good time. There will always be something happening in the world that will mean that it's not the right time to talk about purpose.
That's an insight in itself, by the way.
And
there's never a right time to make tough decisions.
In my 20 plus years of doing this, actually, there will always be something in the context. There's always a wrong timing. And the second thing is, and this is how I led the discussion, is precisely because there is uncertainty and volatility, people, and by people I mean our people, but also our clients, need something that is clear and is I was reading, there's a lot of literature on this topic, but I was reading a really good book over the Christmas break called Infinite Purpose, and thinking about the infinite company and how do you think about this logic of something that really doesn't change regardless of everything else. And so I think there's something really powerful of that deep kind of authentic purpose. And if I think of climate particularly, I use the example of our energy policy. Actually, at that time, that probably felt like somewhat bold and courageous decisions. I've had many clients come to me to say that they bank with HSBC because of our stance on climate and what we've been doing over the years. At some point, you want that. You want someone that's the ideal kind of. You want a client saying...
There's unexpected collateral benefit sometimes from these things that you don't know exactly where it's going to come from, but bold decisions often do.
You're doing it for the right reasons, but ultimately you want people to be attracted to that, also externally as a client. And this is a bit of a cliche, but particularly the next generation of our clients. We run a program in Borneo, so right in the middle of the jungle every year, and we've run it for 3 years. And it's for the next generation of private banking clients. And it is incredible the number of people that come out of that saying, not just that I want to do philanthropy, to your point earlier, but I want to change the business of my family. I want to change the practices of what we're doing. And that is ultimately, and that was the purpose, that ultimately is very powerful.
And maybe looking at Mariah and John, I think, that's that sort of experiential learning mixed with formal learning, mixed with, the settings and informal conversations. But Alison, same question, tough decisions.
I think you, as a leader, you make tough decisions all the time. I think everyone in this room will know that. Yeah. I think the toughest are where there's a healthy tension, and I think what I really like about the framework is this emotional component, and for me, making sure that people understand other perspectives. You may not necessarily agree, but I think you really need to make sure you have sat in someone else's shoes and you've not stepped on their toes, would be the analogy I would draw. So if you don't really understand where they're coming from, then be very careful about saying, you know best. Yes. I would use a similar example actually to Antonio around climate. I mean, we're very passionate about climate change. We believe that this is an existential threat to the planet. We're signatories to the UN 1.5 degree business pledge, but we're an insurance company, so we insure real business, and therefore that means when we have a conversation with a client around energy policy and whether they meet our energy thresholds or not, we try not to be black and white about it, because black and white is rarely a good solution. You need to have a thoughtful conversation and you need to put yourself in their shoes. I've had a lot of conversations here with energy companies who or other heavy industry.
Physical assets, for example.
Other heavy industry who are heavy CO2 emitters. These are really tough conversations. And what we want to encourage people to do is to be on a positive transition and for us to support that. And that means you need to be very careful about black and white. But that does mean I also have very interesting conversations with NGOs as well, who want us to be black and white. And they want there to be bright lines in the sand, and there's a naughty list and a good list, and Santa will only give the presents to the good kids. And I think that's, unfortunately, the world is not quite black and white.
I do think, funnily enough, I think for all of us involved in services, we're going to have, in the next decade, we will have more and more, and I was challenged on it yesterday, and more and more challenges on who you work with.
Which just means you have to have you've got, this whole point of purpose is so absolutely critical. It's crucial for our employees who work for us. And I think if you have a really strong purpose, you will have an absolutely energized workforce who are passionate about what they're doing. And if you believe that you are doing the right thing, then you will be galvanizing. I mean, we have 53,000 people who are galvanized to actually do the right thing. But that means you've got to help them with what does that look like. So if you have a thermal coal policy and an oil sands policy, as we do as well, what does that mean? Well, that means you have a conversation with a customer about, okay, you may not meet our thresholds today, but actually, are you planning on? Because are you actually investing heavily in renewable energy? Do you want to be part of the future, which most of these companies do?
I think there's something very interesting about leaders who lead with values versus rules as well. I think values-based organisations, rules-based organisations, leading in tough times, Ellen.
Well, we certainly have faced many tough times and many tough decisions as well. And I think first, the foundation for us is about transparency, because transparency builds trust, and that's the currency that you need to have with your people when you're going through a tough time and are making tough decisions. And as they were talking, I was thinking of two times where I personally was working with our CEO to make some tough choices. First was during the financial crisis of 2008. Overnight, we were seeing many of our clients disappear, literally. And our whole business model is a supply-demand model. There has to be demands for our services, and the supply is our people. And the demand dramatically dropped. And we were faced with a tough choice because there was no demand, and we had supply for a different level of demand. And in the end, what we decided to do was stick close to our clients, even if they were no longer employed, and stay close to our people. And we made a very conscious decision to, as the leadership team, in a very transparent way, say we were going to, we had just come off a very successful fiscal year, so we had funded a big annual bonus, and we said we're not going to take any bonuses, and we're going to take all the money and keep our teams around the globe intact, so that we can help our clients emerge from the situations that they're in. And that was a hard choice. We had shareholders to respond to, but in the end, I think it helped us help our clients emerge out of their situations more quickly. And it certainly helped us by keeping our people employed through a very disruptive and difficult time. And then the second time was when it was in 2014, and we could see very clearly what automation was going to do to our business. And, we were staring a very difficult beast in the eye. And we had
thousands of people.
Yeah, we had tens of, almost 100,000 people in our business at the time were doing transaction processing for our clients, like processing accounts payable and receivable. We saw very clearly on the horizon that work was going to be lost to automation, and that in order to remain competitive, we were going to have to do that. And so Pierre, our CEO, and I at the time were in his office with the door closed, and we said, well, there are two paths to take. We can get rid of all the people that are doing transaction processing and hire people that have the skills that we need for the future, or we can bet big on our people. And that's where we started really doing the big $1 billion a year investment on learning and development, because we chose to bet big on the people. And that was not an easy choice to make.
And numerically, we've never had a year where we didn't grow, and those people, almost all of them, have managed to actually...
Every single person. I mean, 46,000 of our people have automated their own work, and we've retrained them all to do something different.
You're always careful with some of these things not to sort of sound too corporate about it. I'm very proud of that decision. Because
it was a tough decision.
We could have taken a very different decision.
Yeah, we could have.
And credit to you for making that. So, hopefully I hope a different lens on this, which I think all of us go to Davos panels where everyone is upbeat, everything's great, everything's optimistic, the best of all things in all worlds, and it doesn't work like that.
No.
Right? We all know when we go back on Monday, these tough trade-offs. You said that we make those decisions every day, as Alison said. So hopefully you've sort of more the inspirational piece, but more the reality when when the rubber hits the road back at work. So now I'm going to ask each of our panelists to join a table, if you would.
Okay.
And this is where you have to get to work. I want to keep it very practical. So I'm actually only going to ask each of the tables, whatever you've been briefed before, I'm changing it. Each table, given we've covered a lot on the panels, if you think about going back to the purpose of this work, the purpose of the work is to think about how we develop responsible leaders. And hopefully it's inspiration for each of you in your organizations, but very, very tangibly, we want it to be something that feeds into the YGL and Shaper communities and programs and program design in the next few years. So what I'm going to ask of each of the tables is two questions. One, based on what you've heard here, what's missing? What would you emphasize in the framework in terms of responsible leaders that are capable of managing for the future with impact as well as being successful? And then the second is, what in your experience has been the best way either for you individually or for your organization in developing those attributes so that we can learn and synthesize and bring that back into the program design, keeping it super practical. This is discussion, of course. We hope you take away a lot, but we also want to integrate this back into program design. And I'm going to ask each table to nominate one person to condense that down into two 30-second answers at the end, which is a skill and a talent in itself, which might even be on the list. So 30 seconds only for each answer, and we will have the Beijing hubs as well. So I will, you've got probably about 10, 15 minutes to solve the world. John, set a good example, please. Juan, set a good example, please. This is the fun and games of trying to stop YGLs and Shapers. Trying to stop YGLs and Shapers talking and interacting, which is a good thing, a very good trait. But let's bring in our Prague team from the Shapers community, who are going to get us off to a great start, and I'm timing exactly 30 seconds, and I know they're going to be with me for this. So, over to Prague. What did we think on the two questions?
Hi. So on the first one, what we can add to the 5 elements or to the main aspects is, from what we understood from the panelists, is making a contextual and adaptability in decision-making process. Basically, this is including emotion and including facts and data in your decision, as Ellie Schuh gave a very good example in the end. The next thing is infinite passion and purpose. So looking past your task, completing your task, but looking past it and managing to interact with everyone and making a bigger picture. And the best way in developing these aspects further, I think, is in conveying the message not only to the potential and not only to potential and current leaders, but also to the general public, because the way that we choose the leaders is, I think, more important than the leaders themselves. I think at this point of time, conveying the right message of what the leader should be is the way that we further developed the aspects and the elements.
Very good and very, very succinct. So thank you very much, Pog. You get full marks. Bottle of wine on the way.
Thank you. Thanks.
Now, setting the tone, I know how competitive the shapers are. Can we get those insights? And we want the insights most importantly, but can we get them in the time?
We will try our best. So, hi from Beijing. So, an element that we saw missing in the report is we would like to see an expanded scope of responsibility as we see it in sustainability, not only environmental sustainability, but institutional sustainability and individual for well-being. And the best way to achieve that, it's a combined approach. This is a raise in awareness so that people understand why we need to be more sustainable, so leading a cultural shift that has to be combined with an institutional and regulatory framework. And the best example we had for this was the shift in smoking culture. Not only we had the regulations or not to smoke in public places, but people also understood that smoking is very harmful. And this is how we reduce the problem. We should be able to do the same thing with sustainability.
I like that, and I also think we talk about technology quotient and understanding how to apply technology to solving problems. That public-private balance of regulatory versus kind of more corporate. We're very lucky to have Jin here from the Beijing Hub. Would you add anything to that?
So our team discussed several issues.
So Beijing there, Beijing here. This is the rapporteur. Very good.
Right. So we've talked about resilience because as a leader, you need to go through tough times, and it's important to have that. We talked about motivation, not just motivation in leaders, but also how empower your employees to have the motivation, and accountability and authenticity, also empowerment. So these are the missing elements. And we've also talked about the best practices. And obviously, there are a couple of good examples in the report. We can find, for instance, like Microsoft and ENGIE, who really linked the personal purpose with the company's mission. And also, the ENGIE go deeply into into taking care of the environment. And also, we talked about, for instance, like motivation, resilience, how to take care of each employee's well-being to motivate them further when they are going through some personal difficult times. And we have examples of making active communications between different stakeholders to open up so you understand each other's problems and coming up with solutions. Thank you.
And Gina, you've made me think maybe a note for the team, the point about the case studies. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could actually create some kind of case study living document, living bank, of YGL and Shaper case studies of where they brought together different elements of the leadership.
That would be great.
It'd be very cool. We'll go to Alison's table. Who's the rapporteur?
And do you want me to answer both?
Yeah, do say who you are as well, please.
Great. So hopefully I'm summarizing our group. So the first question was, what do we think of the framework? We thought it was excellent. We didn't notice anything missing. We had two primary questions. One is, if any of the principles are in opposition, how do we manage the trade-off?
Conflict.
So we thought a framework for that would be great. And then also, someone at the table brought up the excellent point that the principles are fantastic, but again, how do you operationalize those? Sometimes the how you do that is really critical. And then in terms of the second question, what works in terms of developing these leaders, we had a number of points. So first would be exposing people potentially to times of adversity or the worst parts of the job, and then potentially having them be observed and then giving them feedback on how they manage that. I thought that was great.
So a conscious process of rotating
yes,
them.
Yes, exactly, a conscious process, yep. The second point we thought was really important was supporting people during difficult times, as our panelists had mentioned earlier. We thought that was super important. And critically, not only supporting people during times where they come on hard times, but also pushing people to take risks, to develop themselves, and then also developing a process for supporting them during those times of learning and increased risk-taking. And then finally, again, it was developing standards for how you can promote this type of leadership in terms of, yes, role modeling is critical, but are there processes and frameworks that you can use to develop responsible leadership within your organization? What does that really mean from an operational perspective?
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the team are jotting all these down as well. So moving to the final table.
Okay, 30 seconds for both questions?
No, each question, you get 30
Oh,
each.
perfect. Okay.
How generous.
Fantastic. First question, what resonates in the framework? Our group believes that the concept of the 5 elements of responsible leadership resonate. The group found that implementing the standards with authenticity is key. The example that was given by a few people at the table, Antonio's personal reference of his leave and why he took leave and why that is important for leaders to demonstrate some personal perspective when they talk about their decision making. What's missing? There are 3 things that are missing. One, whether or how you evaluate the model. What is the standard for evaluating success to ensure that there's a baseline and consistency across platforms and industries? The second is that there needs to be further review on how these elements apply in individual communities, recognizing the global marketplace and recognizing cultural differences. And the final one was we have to recognize generational differences in the implementation and interpretation of the standards.
Yes.
What does it mean for how we implement these standards and who implements these standards based on which generation we come from?
Very, very, very practical. Thank you very much. That's very provocative, some of those actually. The idea of potentially thinking about whether or not there's sort of some kind of standard that's measurable that you work towards, that you maybe you certificate. I mean, on the one hand, it's supposed to be a framework for leaders to think about, but you could imagine that becoming something that is incorporated into, sort of everything from beginner through to mastery and advanced and different settings. Very, very provocative, interesting. Well, Davos is Davos, and we need to get you off to your next half-hour segment. But look, on a very serious note, this has been a rich and wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for really getting stuck in. I listened as I walked around to the tables. A huge thank you to our panelists. I will thank also the teams who've done a phenomenal job, and there's a lot of work behind the scenes. So please do thank the teams. And that includes both the content teams, but I have to say when they said they were beaming in Beijing and Prague, I said, yeah, right. Let's see whether that works. And they've done a brilliant job, and it worked very, very well. So I'm very happy to be proven wrong. Look, most importantly, on your table, you have the report. It's downloadable online. We really want to see this as the beginning of a broader dialogue on responsible leadership, full stop. And then we also want to see this as something that shapes the next generation of learning experiences and leadership development possibilities for the Shapers Group, for the YGL Group. So please, if you feel like you want to send us some feedback, some thoughts, there's never enough time in these settings to do that. Please do. I will also finish by saying a huge thank you to all of our YGL and Shapers, so John in particular, Maria, I think, right across the YGL and Shaper leadership teams, you guys have been absolutely fantastic in the partnership with us. And that's only the beginning of that, but really appreciate all of that and all the interaction that we've had with YGLs and Shapers. And I will conclude by saying, with only a very small group of companies, and we're not looking for lots of companies, and only with companies, to the authenticity point, that are interested in this from an authentic perspective of wanting to be participants, not just finance it, we are looking to expand to maybe 3 or 4 or 5 partners as we go on this journey. So if there is something in this that you would find valuable for your company, please do let us know, because actually I think we feel this is something that needs all the talents and that needs different perspectives from different organisations and different leaders. So do let us know. You can come and let me know. You can let Ellen know, John, Mariah, anyone who would like to be involved, let us know. So on that basis, wish you a fantastic rest of Davos. Hope you enjoyed the show. We've got a gift for you as you walk out, and onwards and upwards with responsible leadership.